Then welcome everyone to our final NORTIA roundtable, the EU, WTO, and regulatory cooperation post-Covid-19. My name is Heidi Maurer, and I'm the co-coordinator of the NORTIA network, who is now in its last few months of funding. And I think, like most of us, we also had to adjust our way of working quite fundamentally as researchers, as instructors in the last few weeks. And I think we were all very disappointed that we had to cancel our final conference in Florence, which was supposed to happen in May. And while it certainly was an adjustment to figure out of how we can keep supporting each other in terms of an academic community, of how we can keep the conversations going, I'm still really amazed and also very thankful for the NORTIA family in how we managed to get ourselves organized differently in the last few weeks. And I actually want to start with thanking especially my other NORTIA members, so Federica, you will meet today, but also Richard Wittmann and Ben Tondra and Robert Kisak, who were really very active in the background of making the last 2 months happening. At the same time, I also want to thank all of you. I think we were really overwhelmed by seeing how much interest and how much engagement and how much activism there was from our foreign policy community in giving feedback to each other, discussing professional issues, but also discussing topical issues of how we try to make sense of EU foreign policy making. So also I really want to thank all the people who spent their Tuesday afternoons in the last 2 months with us in creating really the sense of community. The topic for today came up in a discussion that Federica and me had in reflecting a bit on earlier roundtables. So one issue that came really up several times is this question of how the EU will situate itself in this increasing power politics between the United States and China. And I think we were reminded time and again by many discussants that in order to understand the political role, we can't ignore the economic side of things. And that was really where we said, okay, it would be really useful as this last grand finale of our online series to have a roundtable that focuses a bit more on the EU, WTO, and regulatory cooperation post-Covid-19. And that was really the rationale. I'm really delighted that we managed to draw together such a distinguished panel. And at this point, I hand over to my co-chair, Federica Bicchi, who is going to introduce our speakers.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Thank you for the incredible work that you have put into this NORTIA series to make it work and the amazing conversations that we have had really owe a lot to you and your capacity to bring us closer together in these times. I think it's really fantastic that we have a great topic to finish our series today on the EU WTO regulatory cooperation post-Covid-19. And the 3 experts that are going to enlighten us on this are truly stellar. Ignacio Garcia-Bercero is the Director General of DG Trade in the European Commission, overseeing relations with the US, Canada, and the EU neighboring countries. So really at the heart of things. Alasdair is a professor of international affairs at Georgia Tech in Atlanta and has been writing loads of books on the EU trade policy and so on and so forth. And last but not least, Kalypso Nicolaidis, Professor of International Relations at University of Oxford, St. Anthony's College, again, an expert on many things, most recently on Brexit, but well beyond it. And we're looking forward to bring you back to other topics, Kalypso. The way we're going to do this today is basically to have 2 rounds with our speakers and then have a Q&A and then give them the last word so that we aim to part with a clear understanding of what is going on in Brussels, what does it mean for the world and for the discipline more generally. So I suppose that we can start with Ignacio, and it would be really useful if you could share with us a bit of the insights related to the EU decision to launch a trade policy review. What prompted the review? What you would like to have feedback on? How major do you expect this to be, especially in terms of the potential for change in response to the review? Clearly, this is a process that you expect to go on for a while, but it would be interesting to know how you see it and what is the main objective that the EU is trying to achieve with this. Ignacio.
Well, thank you very much, Federica and Heidi, and it's great to see both of you and Alasdair and Kalypso. Before I get into the substance of what you said, just one little clarification on my bio. Director General is a very, very important post in the European Commission. I used to be a director. I have been a fellow in the St. Anthony's College in Oxford, and I'm now a principal advisor. But thanks for the promotion, nonetheless. Now, in terms of the trade policy review, the European Commission has launched a consultation process before it adopts a communication on trade policy strategies. I think this is the first. The process is going to be that between now and mid-September, we will be receiving inputs from any interested stakeholders, from European citizens. We will analyze those inputs, and then at some point in time before the end of the year, it's not yet totally clear, we will come out with a communication indicating how we think that we need to adapt our trade policy to the new environment. Now, why it is that we are launching a review? I would start by saying that the world today is very, very different to the world of 2015. This was the time when the previous strategic communication of European Union trade policy was adopted in October 2015. So you can immediately see that a lot has changed since October 2015. And fundamentally, I would say two things. One is, of course, the very serious economic impact of the pandemic. We still don't know how much it's going to be because we still don't know how long the pandemic is going to last. But all forecasts envisage that there will be very significant increases of unemployment, very significant increases of poverty in vulnerable countries in particular, and also a much more active role of the state when it comes to the management of the economy. This is going to be the case a little bit in all the key players of the global economy. So the economic context is very different to the one that we have in October of 2015. And of course, the other second big thing, which you have mentioned, is the intensification of the US-China geopolitical conflict and how this has resulted in a very major crisis of the rule-based trading system. So this is the new elements that we need to incorporate, that we need to take into account when it comes to defining what our future trade policy should look like. Now, in terms of objectives, the document for consultation identifies two big objectives. The first one is to try to identify what contribution trade policy can make to a sustainable socioeconomic recovery. And the second one is a little bit more mysterious, if you want, but it is identify how trade policy can help to build a stronger European Union based on a model of open strategic autonomy. This is, by the way, a concept which I think comes from the foreign policy world. So you will see, Heidi, that we tend to incorporate foreign policy concepts also into trade policy. Now, I would like perhaps to make a few comments about open strategic autonomy. I mean, the consultation should help us to have a better understanding about what this means for the European Union trade policy. But I say that there are probably some of the key questions that we are going to be looking into related to these three words: openness, strategic, and autonomy. Now, when it comes to openness, I think it's fair to say that the economic reasons why the European Union should maintain an open trade policy are quite clear. But for this to resonate with European citizens, I think we would need to look a little bit beyond the economic narrative. I think we would need to also try to articulate better why openness in the European Union is essential if we want to help to shape global governance. I mean, after all, it is not only growth, which is happening mostly outside the European Union, economic growth. It is also the increase of CO2 emissions, which is happening outside the European Union. So if we wanted to have an influence, if we want to tackle global challenges, we would need to be able to maintain a model of economic openness. The second big challenge, I think, in relation to openness is that, as I said before, we are going to be seeing a world in which the state plays a much more active role when it comes to the support of the economy, including the targeted support on industries, particularly when we are looking into the high technology sectors. And this is inevitably going to raise issues about the level playing field, how to maintain the level playing field in a situation in which the big players are increasingly making use of subsidies or other forms of trade policy intervention. So I think those are two of the big questions that we would need to look when we try to articulate what the concept of openness means. Now, what does it mean that the European Union trade policy should be more strategic? Again, this is an important question, and I think it has many ramifications. I think that inevitably would imply that we would need to look more in terms of what trade policy can do to contribute to the reform of global governance, assuming that it is one of the key strategic objectives that the European Union wants to pursue, not only on trade, but also on other areas of global governance. So how you articulate trade policy within this broader picture. How do you also better articulate trade with what are the two key political priorities of this Commission, which is, of course, the climate transition and the digital transition? What should this imply in terms of the coherence between trade policy, regulatory cooperation, development cooperation policies? So that's as far as the word strategic. Finally, there's the word autonomy. And I think that at least that seems for me to evolve at least two issues. One is, of course, how the European Union should define its own path when it comes to the US-China geopolitical conflict. Now, that does not mean, I think, that the European Union should be equidistant between the United States and China. And if you look into the consultation document, you will see that we refer to transatlantic relations as the central artery of the world economy that reflects a broader alliance of interests and fundamental values. And when it comes to China, we talk about China being a partner for cooperation, China being also a systemic rival. So we need to define a path. It has to be the European path. That doesn't mean that we are just simply going to be equidistant between the two other major poles of the world economy. And finally, I think there's going to be the question about, do we need to strengthen further our trade policy instruments? There is going to be a world which will be more turbulent, where the European Union will need to be well equipped to defend its interests. Does it mean that we need to adopt new measures to ensure that we are well prepared towards this new concept? So that, if you want, is to place a little bit why we are doing this consultation, what are the big questions that we are going to be looking into. Now, we are doing a consultation, so I'm not supposed to say what the outcome is going to be, but you have raised a question which is related to the outcome, which is to what extent one can expect that this review will result in major changes of European Union trade policy. Now, let me start by making a little bit of an historical detour. I mean, if you look into European Union trade policy since the WTO was created, I think you can discern two main phases. The first one from 1995 to 2006. And I would say at this point in time, the very clear central priority of the European Union was to try to play a leading role in multilateral trade negotiations. Mr. Leon Brittan was the big advocate for a comprehensive round of trade negotiations in the WTO, and he pushed very strongly for that agenda. Pascal Lamy took over the role of Trade Commissioner shortly before the Seattle Ministerial Conference, and his main task during the time when he was Trade Commissioner was to launch the DDA and to try to get the DDA to a successful conclusion. During this point in time, the European Union was not particularly active when it comes to negotiation of free trade agreements. We were mostly negotiating free trade agreements of a relatively simple type with countries in the neighborhood, the only exceptions being Mexico and Chile, that were mostly reactions to negotiations that the United States had started. But this was a phase where we were very much almost exclusively focused on the multilateral trade negotiations. That changed, I would say, in October 2006, when Peter Mandelson was our trade commissioner, and when an important strategic paper was adopted, what was called the Global Europe strategy. And the main thrust of this strategy was to realize that while we should, of course, try as much as we could to bring the DDA to conclusion, we could not just rely on multilateralism. We also have to be actively engaged in negotiating ambitious, comprehensive trade agreements, and to do it mostly, at least initially, on the major emerging economies, with a particular focus on Asia. Now, if you see what has happened since 2006 until this day, the EU has developed a very active agenda of negotiating free trade agreements. To a certain extent, the focus has shifted from being exclusively on major emerging economies to negotiate also free trade agreements with what you could call the like-minded, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. So it has been a little bit of a shift of focus, but a lot of the energy has gone into the negotiation of these comprehensive free trade agreements. Now, as I said, I think it's too early to say what would be the conclusions of this trade policy review. But talking personally, and I'm not supposed to be giving here any official point of view, I see some indications that we may be about to witness another important reorientation of European Union trade policy priorities. And that mainly on four issues. Now, as I said in the beginning, the rule-based trading system is experiencing its most serious crisis since it was created, I would say since 1947. And that implies that inevitably WTO reform is going to be a central objective for European Union trade policy. But of course, we need to be prepared for two possible scenarios. The best scenario would be that the European Union manages to convince the United States and China, probably in that order. First, we need to convince the United States, and then both of us together have a better chance to convince China that there's a need to find a rule-based approach to tackle the tensions which are underlying the trade aspects of the conflict between the US and China, and that therefore we should be ready to find a way to negotiate those issues in the context of the WTO. Particularly on the issue which is the most difficult one, which is the issue about how to establish proper disciplines on subsidies, which, as I said, is not only a China problem, it's going to be, in the face of recovery from the pandemic, a global problem. The second scenario, for which we need to be ready, is that either the United States or China, or both of them are not ready to tackle those issues in a multilateral context. They prefer to manage those issues bilaterally or in other ways. And then I suspect we will still want to be there to try to maintain the WTO relevant. We would want to make as much progress as we can do, but inevitably it's going to be for a more limited agenda. I will go very quickly through the three other issues because I think I'm running out of time.
Yes, 1 minute more.
1 minute more. Okay, so I will be telegraphic. I think the other three issues which I expect that will be important changes is we are going to see a greening of European Union trade policy. How European Union trade policy articulates with the climate transition is going to be critical, and that is going to be reflected probably both in our multilateral agenda, in our bilateral agenda, and also in what the European Union could be doing autonomously. And thirdly, I think from my point of view, it's interesting and encouraging that the consultation document gives a particular focus to the relationship between the European Union and countries in Africa and the neighborhood. I think that, in my view, signals that maybe there is some thinking that the time has come, perhaps, to look a little bit more into those countries which are geographically closer to Europe, countries which are important not only for geopolitical reasons, but also, I would say, from the economic point of view. The economic prosperity in Europe is also very closely linked to the economic development of the countries in Africa and on consolidating our relationships in the neighborhood. So my impression is that the fact that this is given a particular focus on the consultation document, it is also a signal that we may be seeing a certain shift of priorities in that direction. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. What a great start. Alasdair, would you like to come in here? I mean, in your work in the past, you have been at times critical about the extent to which, the European Commission has been able to actually change things. How do you see the trade policy review developing, and how much scope for change? Can you please help us here?
Right, well, thank you very much to Heidi and Federica for organizing this, and thank you to everybody for agreeing to a time change so that I'm not quite so asleep. So hopefully that will be, my comments will be a bit more sparkly than they might have been an hour earlier. Well, I don't know if I'm going to disappoint you, because my comments actually dovetail quite closely with Ignacio's. As Ignacio mentioned, the last sort of serious rearticulation, well, the first serious articulation of EU trade strategy was the 2006 Global Europe Strategy. And since then, the EU's trade policy has been remarkably consistent. It's favored multilateralism, but vigorously pursued bilateral agreements when multilateral progress was stalled. It's been advocated liberalization as a source of competitive advantage, which is not typical. In the United States, you don't hear that, for instance. And there's been a rhetorical commitment to exporting European values. And that consistency has held up despite the global financial crisis or the apparent, albeit fleeting, politicization of trade policy around the TTIP and CETA negotiations. And the most notable change from the Global Europe Strategy that emerged in the wake of the global financial crisis and was reiterated in the wake of the TTIP negotiations was a greater emphasis that the EU would not be naive, that it would defend its interests more effectively. But that did not lead to very much in terms of actual change. Now, the Commission's document launching the review suggests continuity in terms of an emphasis on competitiveness and openness and a commitment to multilateralism and the rule-based system. It again underlines the importance of addressing unfair competition and of exporting European values. The impact of the COVID crisis is most obvious in a new concern about resilience. Right? So that means that the review is actually fairly narrowly framed. Right? So I don't anticipate a major rethink of the thrust of EU trade policy. That said, I think that EU trade policy might actually change this time, albeit at the margins and not really because of the review. There are several reasons for change that may happen this time, and Ignacio's sort of touched upon these, but I want to unpack some of them, perhaps with a slightly different emphasis. So the first one, echoing Ignacio's comment, the global political environment is much more hostile to the EU now than it has been in the past. The United States, under the Trump administration, has turned its back on the rule-based multilateral trading system, as evident in its adoption of unilateral tariffs against China, its exploitation of the national security exemption to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the EU and elsewhere, and in blocking the appointment of appellate body judges. At the same time, the EU's perception of China's rise has become considerably more negative. The anticipated increase in market access have failed to materialize, and what limited gains there have been are beginning to be reversed. In addition, Chinese state-owned enterprises are perceived to be competing unfairly with EU firms in third country markets, as well as within the EU. And as Ignacio noted, this concern, given the response to the COVID crisis, this concern about the impact of subsidies on competition is now not only a China issue, it is a much broader issue. Thirdly, the Commission and a number of member states have come to have much more concern about the security implications of Chinese investments in significant European firms. In addition, there is heightened concern about the increasing disconnect between increasingly stringent European environmental standards and those abroad, to which Ignacio also alluded. So part of this is it's a perceived source of competitive disadvantage, but as Ignacio noted, there is concern that the objective of trying to address these global issues is being undermined by the relocation of polluting production to less demanding jurisdictions. The COVID crisis has heightened concerns about unfair competition and added a new one, the concern about resilience, particularly concern about over-reliance on a few foreign suppliers for key goods and inputs. So now the thing is that the consultation is to extent somewhat after the fact. There are a number of initiatives already underway that are addressing a number of these concerns. And so we have the EU's investment screening mechanism, which aims to provide a more robust check on the security implications of foreign direct investments, is due to come into effect in October. Several member states have or are in the process of tightening their procedures for reviewing investment. Last month, the Commission published a white paper proposing new tools for addressing the impact of foreign subsidies on the single market, so dealing with how to assess acquisitions, public procurement, and addressing imports through tightening countervailing duties. Right? This is the early stages, but this is already moving. In March, the Commission launched a new industrial policy, in part in response to these concerns, but also about trying to realize the green and digital future. Right? But these concerns about unfair competition are in there as well. And we'll also see that in the proposals for financing the EU's proposed collective recovery bonds, you have issues such as a digital taxation and cross-border adjustment tax that have obvious trade policy implications. Right, so these initiatives sort of some of them are part of trade policy, some of them are not part of trade policy, which is underlining the erosion of the distinction between trade policy and internal policies, which Kalypso has written about in the past, and suggests that the trade policy review is following rather than leading some of these changes. So while I do not anticipate a fundamental reorientation of EU trade policy, I do think that reflecting these concerns, EU trade policy is likely to become less naive. There are, however, always gaps between rhetoric and reality. And because of differences amongst the member states, I expect any new instruments to address unfair competition are likely to target only the most egregious forms of behavior. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alasdair. Kalypso, can you tell us what do you make of these economic discussions and the extent to which they affect the political future of the EU, not just within the EU, but of the EU as an international actor? I mean, we know that the COVID-19 has shaken up things dramatically. Will the post-COVID-19 actually strengthen? Will the post-COVID-19 strengthen or weaken the EU's ability to not just be a power in trade, but also to lead change and sort of be a power through trade?
Federica, thank you for asking the question in terms that I recognize from the way past my wonderful colleague Sophie Meunier's work together, where we spent a lot of time. And in a way, what I find fascinating and listening not just to the interventions just now of Ignacio and Alasdair, with which I completely agree, but also having had the pleasure to listen to the last few weeks of NORTIA, and thank you, Federica and Richard, Ben, and Heidi, who's been my wonderful colleague in Oxford. And what I find is that, you know, COVID, of course, to a great extent confirms, you know, exacerbates prior shifts. And that was a lot what we just heard. But really, the question is, what can we learn anew? How can we leave some of the prior biases behind? And I mean, to put it in the picture, you put it in the big picture, Federica. I mean, I think what, you know, the NORTIA conversation made it kind of clear that it's been harder and harder, you know, to stay Kantian in a Hobbesian's world. So there's been this long trend that Europe needs to learn to be Hobbesian. But the question is, will it do that while trying to, in the long term, make the world Kantian, or realizing we can only survive as Hobbesian? You know, that's kind of a bit the summary here. And what does COVID do to this? Well, it depends. Because I think COVID gives us, you know, renews Europe ambition for global leadership. In part, indeed, because both China and the US have failed us, but not just us, Europe, but, you know, the rest of the world. And everyone is waking up to this. And after all, the rest of the world is a big majority vis-a-vis them. They might be the two hegemons, but we are more. And so I think Europe's current schizophrenia is, well, can we show that we can be global leaders in an alliance for multilateralism, as we said last September? Can we renew the spirit? Or is it more than ever about managing our geopolitical solitude in a clever way, in a non-naive way, to echo Alasdair? I think that's the tension. And that's the tension that this open strategic autonomy that Ignacio just told us about, you know, is trying to deal with, to square that circle, as it were. So what I want to put forward and propose to everyone is there's at least three overlapping contradictions, or at least let's call them productive tensions, that this squaring of the circle is about. So one is at the global, in terms of a global strategy. You know, Ignacio talked about the trade policy review, and you can see that there are these two flavors, you know, renewed multilateralism, almost existential multilateralism. That more than ever, the global has to be in part in the EU's image, and we need to be the guardian and nurture it. And indeed, that's what we're doing, proposing health, a big health initiative in global governance, and a whole set of new relaunch of WTO, as Ignacio not only presented now, but he's written a wonderful big paper that I recommend to everyone about WTO, the EU position on WTO reform. Huge agenda there. And I would say it's like existential multilateralism. If we can't do this, what is the EU? It is our vocation, but more than ever. But of course, at the very same time, this existential multilateralism being heightened, but something else is heightened, which we may call progressive protectionism. Now that's also a kind of Trumpian theme, but make Europe great again is not through the same instrument. But there is no question that this was already in the air before COVID. The whole question of diversifying our economies, weaning ourselves both of export dependence and import dependence was in the air, and from a highly political, from the left to the center, the Greens, small c conservatives, all over. Now, of course, with the resilience theme that Alasdair talked about, this is more than ever in the cards. So that's the first tension really, is how does EU, square that circle? And open strategic autonomy, open and autonomy, obviously, it's a hard circle to square, not just concretely, but in terms of narratives. And part of the question is the extent to which we are, in order to reopen or keep open the global economy, to what extent are we ready to use our muscle, including threats of closure and autonomy? And I think that to use just one example on the side of China, Ignacio talked about state aid. Indeed, finding a better way to multilaterally manage state aid in the post-COVID world, where state aid will have exploded, is going to be a huge challenge. Because to a great extent, yes, we want to open and we want to say we're not going to have countervailing duties and all the rest of it. But isn't there a risk, and in a way that's a question to Ignacio, he and I have been having this conversation, a real danger of wishful projection, that we somehow assume that China, and to a lesser extent US, is too much, we know it's not like us, but still we're wishfully assuming that yes, it could be at least more transparent on state aid. But does it even know how to do this? Given the opaqueness of its system, and we can all have that conversation. There might also be wishful projection on the US side, especially when we talk about the digital transition, data privacy. We want to believe that we can do it with the US and that we'll have safe harbors, etc., and we'll continue to do so. But I think that this is also in part wishful projection. Again, question mark. So squaring that, and if we find this, to what extent are we ready to use the stick and not just the carrot, and be more autonomous is one big question. But very quickly, my other two, there was multilateralism, progressive protectionism. Second, looking more directly at bilateral trade instruments. The tension we have is between politicization and geopolitization of trade. Again, something that Sophia and I worked on together. Now, politicization, of course, can be used as Alasdair just did, that is the domestic underpinnings of whatever we can do externally as enabling or as resistance. But of course, that also has an external dimension, as in when we politicize trade, we want the other country to change things inside as a condition for trade liberalization. And there, I think that, Alasdair, alluded to it, but it hasn't really worked. It's very hard to change other countries. Sometimes you can empower constituencies within, as the recent agreement with Vietnam shows, which is very interesting, and the labor unions that were pushing for the trade leverage of the EU. But we're always going to be vulnerable to accusation of neocolonialism, etc. And indeed, that's part of the background music. And in any case, we are clearly moving to a world where it's about geopolitization of trade. That power through trade is both defensive and offensive. But in the post-COVID world, we're talking about strategically dealing with strategic industry. I think the issue of screening foreign direct investment, above all China, is going to be more important than ever. We've just started before COVID, and the conditions under which we do this are going to be fascinating. And if you link this with reshoring, let's see what happens. But of course, in that world, the whole question of greening our trade policy is kind of in between politicization and geopolitization. How do we reconcile, before it was, well, about conditionality and trade, be green, other country. But now we're moving to more, using our muscles, carbon tax, hard incentives. And of course, we know that different member states are more or less prone to this, to doing this and to using the tax in such a way. So we will, and of course, these two are related, we can discuss. But finally, let me just put on the table the last big contradiction and tension, which has to do with what Ignacio and I call the trade regulatory nexus. That is that, of course, this whole world of regulatory cooperation as an underlying either effect of trade in a passive way, the so-called Brussels effect, or as a kind of more active condition, is something that, you know, we've seen forever. It's a very old theme. Recently, it's very much at the core of the Brexit debate. And here I just want to suggest that the tension or almost contradiction for the EU is there are two logics there. One is what I call the compatibility logic. We do things with you if your rules are compatible with ours. Your banks are as safe, your professionals are as well-trained, etc. Your airplanes have the same safety standards, you name it. And we do this, as I've described in my work before, through managed mutual recognition. Not pure mutual and blind mutual recognition, but managed with elements of verification, reversibility, etc. But the problem is, you know, if you look at the Brexit negotiation, in some areas, that's fine. You know, they're compatible, very compatible, the Brits and the Europeans. But of course, that's not what trade policy is only about. It's about acquiring through policies, sometimes competitive advantage. That's what tariffs were. The EU, and you could say, well, you can disguise it as, well, you need to be part of our ecosystem. But there's always a plus. The EU needs a bit more than simply the condition that we need to make sure you are compatible with us. We still need to, you know, protect our industries, and our services industries are very important, especially in the global tech world. You know, we can't afford to have countries that might not be cheating on their regulation or be less safe, but maybe have more nimble regulations in AI or quantum computing or what, or you name it. And if that's the case, then I think that the real tension for the EU is to have to really figure out what narrative it's putting forward. Is it are we moving to a world where we are going to have regulatory development, regulatory cooperation, and conviviality of regulation through trade? Or are we going to have a world where we use our regulatory instruments much more competitively and strategically to maintain our advantage in a world of, you know, geopolitical solitude? And maybe we don't have to resolve any of these three tensions, but at least we need to be aware that we need to live with them.
Thank you very much, Kalypso. I must admit that the expression open strategic autonomy elicit in myself the same reaction that the expression principled pragmatism
protectionism, pragmatism, principled pragmatism. Yeah.
Sort of the inbuilt tension where, you know, it seems that there is a direction of travel that is suggested. But thank you very much for this first round. May I kind of bring you to zoom in on one specific aspect that a couple of you touched upon, but it would be interesting to hear your views in a sort of a 2 minutes one-liner about transatlantic relations, because we all seem to be trapped into a sort of a holding our breath and waiting until we get a good result from the US elections. But I mean, can you complicate this picture a little bit for us and tell us how you see transatlantic relations evolving in the next year or so? What kind of scenarios do you think we should keep in mind when it comes to transatlantic relations? 2 minutes each, this time beginning with Alasdair, and then moving on to Kalypso and Ignacio last. and then we move to the Q&A. Alasdair, would you like to start, given your Atlanta position?
Yes, thank you. As the token American, I get to go first. It's going to be tough to do in 2 minutes, but I'm going to have to dust off my crystal ball. But I think when talking about the transatlantic relationship, I think it's useful to provide a bit of context before prognosticating. To paraphrase Mark Pollock and Greg Schaefer somewhat, I think it's useful to think of the transatlantic relationship having 3 components. There's the intergovernmental component, which is the political leadership, high politics, things like the TTIP negotiation. You have the transgovernmental level, which is day-to-day cooperation amongst governing bureaucracies. And then there's the transnational level, which is business dealings, tourism, educational exchanges, etc. Now, the intergovernmental component attracts the most attention, but it is metaphorically the tip of the iceberg. And Trump's adverse impact on the transatlantic relationship has been most pronounced at the intergovernmental level, but it has affected all 3. At the intergovernmental level, we've had the EU depicted as a rival and as a foe. We've seen fundamental differences on a range of important policies, the WTO, climate change, Iran. The transgovernmental level, the damage has been less by design and more by neglect, largely associated with the failure to fill key positions. The transnational level, we've had a degree of trade disruption, but arguably more important has been the impact of Trump's policies on immigration, where procedural changes had already made it harder for European firms to bring their employees to the United States, and we now are in a situation justified under COVID of a suspension of all visas through the end of the year. COVID has also dealt a direct blow in terms of trade, with both economies tanking, and we're now seeing problems with travel, as with you wisely not letting us in. And I have no idea what to expect if Trump wins a second term. All indications are he doesn't either. But other than we're going to have more of the same, whatever the same is. So I'll focus on what I think a Biden victory would likely mean. At the intergovernmental level, the mood music would improve immediately. If you look at Europeans' views of the United States under George W. Bush and under Obama, they flipped immediately upon Obama's election. Europeans would again be perceived as key allies of the United States. There would be much less use of unilateral tariffs. US positions would become closer to European ones on things like climate change and WTO reform. And there would also be more room for robust cooperation with respect to China. The US and the EU would still have their differences, including with respect to the governance of big tech, to which Kalypso alluded, EU food safety regulation, aircraft subsidies. But these disagreements would fall on much more familiar terrain. I'd also anticipate improvement at the transgovernmental level as more established appointments would be made. At the transnational level, I would anticipate a return to pre-Trump immigration policies. Probably the 232 sanctions would be allowed to expire without anybody talking too much about it. But the recovery of trade and travel will depend on the economic recovery on both sides of the Atlantic and on concrete progress in the United States on fighting the pandemic, neither of which I'm optimistic come out in the near term. The impact of a Biden victory would be even more pronounced if the Democrats take back the Senate, which would accelerate political appointments and facilitate more pronounced changes in US policy. The outcome of the election in November is therefore highly consequential for the transatlantic relationship as well as for the US. Thank you.
Thank you. That's good to hear, because in a way, there is a part of me that is concerned that the damage made to multilateralism itself will not be quickly repaired by a Biden victory, and the quick use of unilateralism remains more ingrained. While it's good to hear that instead you are more optimistic. Kalypso, what do you think?
I'll be very quick because I'd love to hear the Q&A. And I mean, I agree with everything Alice just said on, you know, the move from Trump to Biden. Of course, at this moment, we have to answer, it depends, and make a huge difference. But I just want to make 3 points about how we shouldn't overstate the difference, or in a more positive way, that we should not let go of this kind of renewed EU ambition for global trade leadership. One is that in the purely transatlantic domain, we've seen with the MRAs in the 90s and TTIP in the last 10 years and more, how difficult it is because of this in-between transgovernmental level to deal with the US, because they don't have our kind of culture of bringing trade and regulation together. It's all about regulatory turf and regulators not making concessions or external delegating their regulatory power to foreigners in the name of trade. And that will remain. It's a structural characteristic of the US, even if Biden is in power. The second thing is, I think we may have learned the limits of the mega regionals, or, you know, big transatlantic, trans-Pacific, et cetera, agreement that, and we could expand on this. But I think we're going to shift towards more of a model of open plurilateralism, that doing things under WTO, especially if we need to re-engage China, however hard it's going to be. And the third reason is our neighborhood. I mean, we need to bring the neighborhood back in this conversation. Of course, Federica and many of you in the room, in the Zoom room, know much on this and will agree. And this is where we do trade strategy first. And indeed, with we've seen, I think Africa is a huge issue that is rising. For the first time ever, the whole commission went to Africa, you know, in January, a big signal. I sense a move from the kind of fraught EPAS negotiation to a much more holistic, and call me wishful thinker, but I hope that's the case. And so, I mean, there's neighborhood to the east, Middle East and Africa, and this is where the name of the game is for Europe. And so that's irrespective of the US. I don't think the US has a strategy for that region, and that's right and proper. So for these 3 reasons, I completely, yes, Biden will make a huge difference, but there are structural factors that will not change.
Thank you, indeed. Ignacio, I may have promoted you a bit too much, but certainly you were very involved in the TTIP negotiations. So you have the benefit of looking to the recent past to understand the present and try to gauge the future. What do you see?
Yes, okay. I mean, let me start by saying that I agree with what both Kalypso and Alasdair have said. Now, the first point which I would like to make is that whoever wins the US election, something which I am quite convinced is that TTIP, as it was conceived, is not going to come back. I think if you want to hear my personal opinion, there were some problems in the design of TTIP, in a way, in the direction of what Kalypso has said, trying to bring together in a big comprehensive negotiation between 2 big players like the United States and the European Union, market access, regulatory cooperation, and defining the rules for the 21st century. Those were the 3 components of TTIP. It was too difficult to manage. There were too many contradictions, too much misunderstandings about what we were trying to achieve. I don't see a Biden administration having a huge appetite for big bilateral negotiations in any case. TPA is going to expire in June of next year. And I don't see, quite frankly, either a great enthusiasm in the European Union to go to TTIP point 2. So I wouldn't see that as being in the agenda. Now, I'm not going to comment about the second Trump administration. I think we can expect a little bit more of the same. We will try to manage the best way we can a very complex relationship, but I would not comment on that. What can one expect from the Biden administration? First, I have been hearing quite a few people speaking for the Biden campaign that talk about WTO reform as something that they would like to do and that they would like to do on partnership with Europe. So I hope that that's going to be the case. Even with the Trump administration, we have been able to work together on some aspects of WTO reform. And certainly I would hope that with the Biden administration, issues like reform or dispute settlement, about sustainability in the context of the WTO, would be hopefully easier to handle. So I have an expectation that with the second Biden administration, it will be easier for the United States and the European Union to cooperate in WTO reform. Quite frankly, a question to which I do not have an answer is what would be the policy of a Trump administration vis-a-vis China. I would certainly expect that they would want to work more with allies. That does not mean that they would want to negotiate with China in the context of the WTO, or would they think that this is something very difficult to manage? I mean, after all, the Obama administration was trying to negotiate rules about China without China. So what would be the policy of a Biden administration? I think it's still a bit of a question mark. On bilateral, I don't expect big initiatives. I still think that there is a good case for regulatory cooperation between the United States and the European Union. I still think it's much better done outside the context of a trade negotiation. The big challenges are going to be digital and climate. Those are going to be the two big areas of regulation. I mean, on climate, I would expect that it would be easier, certainly, to discuss those issues with the Biden administration and hopefully to try to understand how far our respective Green Deals can be compatible and work towards similar objectives. On digital, there are tensions. I think it's clearly we should not have wishful thinking. There are tensions relating to taxation. There are tensions relating to competition policy. There are tensions relating to privacy. I still think that it may be possible to find positive resolutions of those tensions, but it's clear that it's going to be more complicated than on the issue of climate. So I would leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As Federica was already mentioning, and this is now the last event in our spring series, although we are already slightly into summer. But I could also not have wished for a more stimulating and inspiring final roundtable. So thanks so much to our three speakers and for Federica for chairing. I think it's also showed us again that we need much more conversations between the trade people and the foreign policy people. I think one thing that showed us, or that this last 2 months showed us, that of course it's more difficult. After 1 hour looking at the screen, it's getting tricky to focus. But at the same time, I think we also all agree that it actually allows us to be much more inclusive and to bring voices in that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to have. So also, again, thank you for Ignacio, and also thank you to Alasdair for joining us from the US. Of course, time difference is always an issue. We also time and again had now more colleagues from Japan joining. So I think there's also this added value that we can bring. So from my side, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our speakers, and I hope you all have a very good summer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.